Sanjay is a very interesting person, to say the least. He has worked on technology platforms at scale. He's the product manager for MapMaker at Google. He has managed the product management aspects of Aadhaar, of India Stack, as many of you on the call know, which includes the unified payments interface, as well as the other elements, especially digital
I
locker.
just finished reading.
Hello,
I just finished reading.
can you hear me?
Yeah, Akshay, please could you mute people who are not talking? Thanks.
All right. And of course, I met him first when we met at Step, which was when he was actually shaping the product management aspects of education platform, which many of you today know as Diksha and Sunbird, but the foundations of that were laid in the hands of Sanjay. And so that's another fascinating aspect of his background. Of course, then he said that once having thought about technology platforms at scale, let's move to inclusive innovation at scale. So moved on to set up the Bharat Innovation Fund. He's a partner there, where the whole idea was to create more and more entrepreneurs, and also the idea of the Bharat Inclusion Initiative, which is how do you leverage such technology platforms for creating benefits to billions across the society. And that's the whole idea with which he moved into setting this up. And then, of course, went on to set up the Center for Innovation, Incubation, and Entrepreneurship, as CIIE as it is known. Other interesting aspect of Sanjay has been that having worked on Aadhaar so much, he also worked on the open source facet of Aadhaar, if you will, which is the modular open source identity platform, which could take the architecture and the technology of that thinking across to different other countries. He is the chairman of the technology board of MOSIP, and MOSIP is interestingly slowly and steadily gaining its own relevance across different countries as we speak. He's an iSpirit fellow, and he is the one who has worked intensely on this whole idea of cashless, paperless, and presenceless construct. I have been witness to his fascinating presentations on what is the way to think about these facets. How do you create a cashless society, a present paperless society, and a presenceless society? He has also served on the RBI's technology subcommittee on, interestingly, household finance. And there is a very common case study you may have encountered over these many months of our association, where this character called Rajni shows up, and he has had a hand in the shaping of the character called Rajni, who is a street vendor in India who actually is building her own entrepreneurial ventures leveraging these technologies. He is, of course, a global evangelist of inclusive technologies. He has spoken at multiple international forums. He's a TEDx speaker, and I could keep going on and on and on. But I think I hope you get a context. And like we all do these chats, Sanjay, you and I will have an interaction with small gaps in between for our audiences to ask any questions, share any reflections. And so, with that background, welcome to this evening.
Thank you, Sanjay.
Awesome. So with that, let me open up the discussion today. And of course, this discussion would be best placed if we started our conversation with the UPI story. Your tryst with UPI, how did you go about it? And so it would be good to warm up from there, because everybody, of course, is familiar with the idea of the UPI, but we would love to hear your personal story of how did you bring it about.
Thank you, Sanjay. That is, UPI was an incredible experience, and it actually started with a fairly interesting conversation that Nandan had with the NPCI board. They had asked him to be an advisor. And what Nandan told them was that, look, I mean, you're really working with these old technologies and I don't want to be there. Build something new. And so they actually put it back to him saying, what would you recommend we build? And so then Nandan came back to a group of us at iSpirit and said, we have an opportunity to build India's next generation payment system. Tell me, what do you think it should be like? And one of the thoughts that was sort of running through our heads at that point was around how we bring about more formalization into society. And also, what was the barriers to the increased digital payments? And in that time, payments was only cards. Digital payments was just about cards. And the sense I had was that, I mean, today, of course, RBI has put all sorts of caps on the debit cards, but previously it was very simple. You used a credit card, somebody had to pay for the cost of credit, typically to the shopkeeper who paid it in the form of MDR. But when you use a debit card, there's no cost of credit, and yet the shopkeeper gets charged about the same. And so it was just because of the same form factor. And we felt that we had to actually get out of that form factor a bit and see where we could make sure the payment happened from bank account, so there was no actual costs involved in it. And we felt that mobile would be an interesting way to do it. So we essentially sort of brainstormed, figured out a way by which we could potentially do direct from the bank account to somebody else's bank account at a very low cost, because there will be no cost of credit, there should be no cost of chargebacks and so on. So then you take out costs from the system and at the same time make it faster. And that we felt would be the ideal way for us to do payment. And this was not just me alone. I mean, this was a group of us. You've met some of the others. You met Pramod Verma, one of the key people in this as well. And so that's what we ended up doing, was to say, let's make a very simple system which works off mobile phones, because they're getting very popular, which allows a user to approve a small credit from their bank account to somebody else's bank account. And because you're doing it on mobile phones, you also have the potential to pull. And so it's not just a push, and but eventually the transaction is a credit push. And this is the idea we sold. I mean, just to be clear, when we were doing the selling, we also looked at what else is happening around the world. And this is just around the time where, if you remember, Square was getting quite popular in the US. And Apple had just launched Apple Pay, which was interestingly a layer built on top of the card rails. And what we felt, same with Square. And I think we had looked at Stripe as well, which was again built on top of card rails. So all three of these systems, which are gaining prominence around the world, were not reducing costs. They're just adding ease of use. And what we wanted to do was bring in the ease of use, but also remove costs, because that's what we felt would make the difference in terms of adoption, in terms of bringing it to everyone. And that's really sort of what we went through in terms of thinking how to build it. And so then we sort of thought through, we worked on two aspects. What would the user interface look like? And what the backend protocol would be, what would allow communication between my mobile app and then the whatever switching system we used and the banks. And so once we had this idea, we sold it to NPCI at the board level. They bought it, then they said, why don't you go ahead and build out the specifications for it. And then we went through, we figured out what it would be, we wrote the protocol up, and then we again took it through the entire internal NPCI process, got approval, took it up to the RBI. We also had to sell it to the banks because they had to participate, and so on. So it was a fairly long process, but because we were actually taking costs out of the system, and because we were making it super easy and convenient for others to use, we've eventually got approvals to go ahead. And of course, I think Nandan's backing was critical to this. NPCI's backing to what we were doing was also great. NPCI was also part of the team that put a couple of people with us to make sure that everything we were doing would work within the banking system. And so we took everybody along with us on this journey, and this is where we are today based on that.
Fascinating. I think it'll be lovely to hear from you two dimensions. One is you talked about it will work for all, and you said it so easily, which was the whole inclusion angle of this idea. And I love there's a slide that you have which talks about moving away from low volume, high value interactions to high volume, low value interactions to drive inclusion. So would love to hear your elaboration on that. And the second thing is, all of this was done by a group of volunteers. So how did you do that, right? How do you get a group of volunteers to build something that would change the landscape of an industry?
So when we started out, it was not really to think about changing the landscape of the industry, right? I mean, it was sort of saying, look, let's try and build something new. And while you're completely confident it would work, there's always a question of everything else beyond the technology that goes into making something actually take off, right? I mean, you need adoption, you need people pushing it, you need the the ecosystem that finally drives it ahead, right? Beyond the technology just working. So I think that was one of the concerns that we had. And I think that is where, being a volunteer helped, because, you had no vested interests and people sort of did give you that opportunity. I think Nandan's backing, the fact that we had come from Aadhaar and done something transformational, all of those sort of credibility pieces, I think, pushed up our case and allowed people to actually listen to us and give us a chance. But that, in turn, I think we also proved that this was going to be foundational, and everybody would be able to participate. In terms of everybody being able to participate, I don't know how many of you know this, but even today there is a interface that is not based on the smartphones, which actually allows people to do UPI transactions over USSD. And in fact, the U is unified, which actually allowed a whole bunch of things to work together. So when we designed it, we built this platform, and our view was we wanted to make sure everybody could participate. I don't know how many of you have had the pleasure to hear Professor Phatak from IIT Bombay. He has also been a very large part of the payment ecosystem in India. And his statement is, I want that Bhajiwala or Bhajiwali in Jumri Talahiya to accept a digital payment. How are you going to make it happen? This is sort of his constant reminder to us that we need to think about how what we do impacts the lives of everyone. And in fact, Professor Phatak was an advisor to NPCI. He was also, I don't know if he still is, he's standing invitee to the Board of Payment Systems in India. He's been a very transformational figure in payments. And I think that his influence was tremendous. But I mean, he didn't have an operational role in this, but this is his constant words, and you're reminded of those every time. So that's what it was, Sanjay. We looked at it, we made sure it would work for everyone. In addition to the protocol that allowed this interchange, we also found a way by which the payment could be initiated through USSD so that somebody with a feature phone could access it. And eventually, I mean, our view was that AEPS would be the mechanism for people with Aadhaar without a phone to access payments, while UPI would be the one for smartphones with data, and in between was USSD. So we actually made sure we had everyone could participate in payments.
Which is fascinating, because as I think all of you who have been working together on this, and Pramod also posted a comment on the chat side, the idea that if you have a smartphone, you are included in the ecosystem. If you have a feature phone, you are included in the system. If you have no phone, you are still a part of the same digital payment ecosystem, right? And I think that's a very fascinating construct to build across. And I would like to hear from you also that when you were doing this idea of public good or a digital public good was also emerging. And then in parallel, we were talking about this societal missions, which were more like what this group is sort of working with, which is societal missions sitting on top of digital public goods. And how did this thinking start evolving? What in your mind is the nuance between building horizontal digital public infrastructure and then using it to instantiate, say, a lending, credit, healthcare, so that it is transformative in different kinds of missions? So what's your thinking around that?
So the key thought that was part of this. It was part of the Aadhaar conversation as well, where of course we did much more than build that layer, was to say, how do we enable others to work on top of what we have done? Because it's only when that happens can you actually start to build solutions. Otherwise, you end up in this thinking where you have to build the entire solution as opposed to build the foundation and let others innovate on top of it. So that's sort of really the beginning of platform thinking, right? Is where you basically provide this layer which can do something, do it really well, and then enable things on top of it to then actually provide the solution to the user. Of course, you have to have one foundational use case which you potentially either build or encourage yourself, but beyond that, other people should be able to do it. So in the case of ID, it was, you did enrollment and you could do auth, but then, and the government enabled it for basic subsidies and ration and things like that. But the idea there was that you could build it as part of KYC into, say, bank account opening, into when you, at that time, private sector was also envisioned as using it. So while taking up a job, you could make sure that your ID credentials were available to your employer. And wherever you needed an ID, you would be able to use it. And without the UIDI having to write it, every single application that used it. And so the way was to build this layer, which allowed everybody else to build on top of it. The same thing with payments. I mean, even UPI, eventually, it was only the banks who were able to participate. But as per our design, the idea was it was a protocol. You should be able to build something on top of that protocol, which would allow another system, if you will, to participate. So for example, you want to do micropayments from within a game, you should be able to do that. If you wanted to be able to build an if then else, so that if money comes from here, you do X, Y, Z. Like say you're a company and you want to take certain money away for tax purposes, right? I mean, you want to put into a tax account. You should be able to do that through a simple programmable interface, right? A simple if then else on top of the incoming money and make that happen. So in some senses, that was the thinking, was to say, how do we build a fundamental layer, which, and our viewers, you would have people building on top of it, which would then enable all of these things to happen. Now, many of those things didn't happen because the regulatory thinking, which runs independent of the technology thinking, was such that they felt the risks would be too high and so on. And certainly they put these bounds around what you could think. But that was sort of very fundamental to our thinking. I mean, Pramod's is the architect for both of these systems, and that's part of the thinking that we share. And much of the India Stack team shares the same kind of thinking, is to say that, look, why don't we build something that is an enabler? And that's really what the idea of digital public infrastructures is, that this is an infrastructure on which you can build something digitally, because then many people can build different things on it and then use that building block in whatever application they need to be building. And so I think that was if you think through, that's really the thing. It permeates almost a lot of the work that we have done in the India Stack.
Right. And it's fascinating how it compounds over time. So the question that comes to my mind is, when you were there at the beginning, this is almost sounding like the Big Bang Theory, saying going back to the point when the Big Bang happened. So what was the first thing that you decided to build? Just the first step. And why did you choose that first step? What was that after which it was entropy, right? After that, it was an expanding universe.
Within UPI?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, within UPI, at least one of the first things we built was actually a demo showing how it would work.
Awesome.
And so we actually had this little demo which showed you how the transaction would flow. And we had, of course, imagined what would happen behind it, but that was the first visible thing that people had.
Awesome. I think that is brilliant, saying that the first thing that you built was not something that would work, but something that would show the possibilities, saying this is possible, right? And after Innovation Fund, and why and how did you decide to put that together? What was going on? Tell us something about that story.
So there are two parts to the story, right? One was the part which I was sort of playing a role, and then I merged with another stream that was already work in progress. So, so the part that I was playing was that we had sort of built many layers of the India stack, and one of the thoughts that we had when we were building it was that this would encourage young startups to build for India, and we are actually expecting to see a lot more excitement in terms of early stage ideas being built and tried out. And frankly, what we saw was the large companies doing it, right? I mean, we saw Geo use eKYC and go to 100 million users in 3 months. I mean, they actually onboarded 100 million customers in around 90 days. The fastest 0 to 100 million, if you will, in telecom history. But we didn't see young startups, right? I mean, at least none that were that visible. And we saw banks take it up, and so on. And we were trying to figure out what was the factor there. And it seemed to us that there was not enough early stage risk capital to build around this. We thought there were not enough use cases to build around it. And so on the use cases side, one of the things we did at iSpirit was actually we ran a pilot program to see how you could do digital lending in a paperless, cashless, presenceless manner. And we actually showed that you could be completely regulatory compliant with the regulations as of that date and use the India stack elements to make sure you could do a loan instantaneously and 100% compliant, right? And digital lending did start to take off. But in the meantime, I mean, this happened around the same time I was looking for early stages capital. And so the thought was that maybe what we should do is find some VCs who are willing to put in early stage capital to support this ecosystem, and let's see it take off. And when we went around, and most of the VCs essentially sort of said that we are looking for a breakout before we put money into something, right? I mean, yes, there's a lot of activity, it looks exciting, but something needs to break out before we start to put more money into the space. And so it became clear that we had to be able to bring in the capital, given the support necessary to show something that would excite investor interest. And so we then found some folks who are willing to put up the capital. And we tried to find maybe somebody else who would take their capital and do this. But essentially, we were told, no, we want somebody from the team who's doing these things to be a part of this for us to make sure it works. And so that's the point at which I put up my hand and said, maybe I'll take this up as my next challenge, is to try and bring investor capital to support early stage ideas. And that's the journey that took us towards the fund. On this journey, one of the things I was told was I had no investment experience. I've been an engineer most of my life and a product manager. So they said, I need to team up with somebody who has investment experience. I mean, I was not even an angel investor. I still am not, right? So I had to find somebody to team up with. And that's the process I was on when I met up with the folks at IIM Ahmedabad. And IIM Ahmedabad had been on its own journey. They started by incubating startups and so on in the early stage. And they also hit the same problem, that the ideas they were building from the ecosystem weren't getting the support from the VC ecosystem as well. And so they also then came up with the idea that they needed to have a fund. And they did the first one in the space of sustainable energy called Infuse. And having done that, they were now looking to do the next one. And their thought was to do something slightly more mainstream. And they felt that they wanted to push the Indian ecosystem towards building IP-led startups. And that's where the name innovation comes from, was to say, we've done a lot of copy-paste entrepreneurship. We've done a lot of productized services. It's time for us to build startups that have IP in them. And so they wanted to be at the cutting edge of that. And that's the idea that was leading them towards creating this fund called the Bharat Innovation Fund. And in some sense, we had a good meeting of minds because I thought that was also a worthwhile objective. And we decided to team up. In the process, the folks I was talking to, my sources of capital, had a little different opinion on this. And in fact, some of them turned to say we'll put philanthropic capital as opposed to investment capital, and the others insisted that it actually be a separate pool of money so that there was better separation of the two for whatever reasons that they wanted it to be. And so we ended up actually with doing three things at the same time within the CII umbrella. And by the way, it's called CII.co now. We have a new brand name. We ended up creating, so there's a Bharat Innovation Fund, which is for IP-driven startups out of India. We have the Bharat Inclusive Tech Seed Fund, which is for startups that are using technology for inclusion. And it's a seed fund. It's a slightly earlier stage money than the other one. And then we have the Bharat Inclusion Initiative, which is a philanthropic capital to provide support to early stage ideas, even before you put in investment capital into it. So we ended up with three pools of capital that we are managing out of that team. And so all of that is done out of CII. So it ended up being a broad portfolio approach, which I think worked reasonably well. And that's what we're doing out of the fund.
In this run, you chose initially the idea of Bharat, which in your narratives in the past has represented the larger India rather than the well-served India. So what was the thinking in terms of this Bharat Inclusion Initiative, Bharat Innovation Fund, and how does that thought continue to permeate?
So Bharat Innovation Fund actually has an interesting story behind it as well. So I don't know if you recollect, there's a time when our Prime Minister visited the Silicon Valley, his first visit to the US, and he announced a fund there. So before he went there, he sort of asked around, what should I do? What can I announce, etc. And somehow the folks at IIM Ahmedabad were in touch with his office and they said, you're doing this fund. And so the name Bharat Innovation Fund actually came from him. And personally, from the Prime Minister, okay, not his office. And so that's what he announced. And so that Bharat was more broader India name, while when you look at Bharat Inclusive Tech Seed Fund or the Bharat Inclusion Initiative, it's actually around that inclusive Bharat, where we talk about, where we sort of have this model in our mind of India and Bharat as being sort of two parts of this nation that we think about differently, because there is really two personas and two different ways of interacting and aspirations, etc. So the two of those arms that of capital that I talk about are actually focused on that aspect of it, while the third, the Bharat Innovation Fund, is focused on the, in fact, on the higher tech end of it, right? Because we're talking about IP-built tech and innovation. Right. So that's where we're supporting a company that's building a cancer drug. We're supporting all sorts of very interesting ideas which are coming out of India, but which are at the cutting edge of use. And in fact, many of them probably find global application as opposed to just in India. While the Bharat Inclusive Tech Seed Fund is about tech that goes out and makes sure we are serving the inclusion agenda.
Fascinating. The first part of the conversation was about building technology that others can build on. Now you go into saying, let us create a funding ecosystem that others can benefit from, right? So this interesting thread, which is building stuff that others can use rather than building stuff for your own consumption's sake. And I think a lot of the societal platform practitioners on the call have been sort of discussing this idea that moving away from building technology for your own use to building technology for use of others rather than raising money for yourself, how do you create an ecosystem that raises money for others, is an interesting flip point and interesting transition. So thank you for sharing those experiences. We have a few more minutes to go, so I would love to now move to Sanjay Jain, the person. You have been an enabler, an orchestrator, a product thinker. These are interesting mental states, and I'm sure that a lot of people here would love to hear your inner journey of becoming who you became over time. So we'd love to hear some thoughts on how did these changes happen? What have you observed?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think one of the things is I've been very fortunate to work with really good teams to make these things happen. And in some sense, none of these things are very individual contributions. Even if one person's the face of it, it always takes a great team effort to bring it together. And I think that's sort of been the role for me, particularly on the product side, has always been about how do I make sure that everybody's aligned towards the right cause, the right vision, and is then able to work towards it and make it happen. And I think, whatever gaps there are that need to be plugged in, we either have to find somebody to do it or make sure it gets done within the team that's putting it together. And so so I would say, that's been the journey over the last, I would say, slightly more than a decade for me, is trying to make sure we get teams aligned towards not the project or the product, but actually the mission, right? Because at the end of the day, that whatever you do is sort of pushing towards that mission. And so if you look at MapMaker, the mission was really how do we bring maps to the world, right? And not just how do I make Google Maps better. So from that perspective, if you think in terms of that mission and you're able to bring, which is bigger than the team. I mean, while the team is bigger than me, my point is the mission is even bigger than the team. And then you're able to get that energy and get the internal stakeholders, the external stakeholders aligned so that you can then go marching towards that. And that's been the journey so far. And I think that's worked well all through these years, is to be able to find those missions, to find those partners and make it happen.
At the same time, these are difficult journeys, right? So how did you sustain your motivation to work in environments which is like totally ambiguous, uncertain, unknown? You're a product thinker, right? So now you're thinking about building something which is evolving as you're building. So you have to yourself go through that process of being invested. So what were the difficult moments? How did you keep yourself energized?
I mean, every one of these projects, of course, I mean, it's a classic startup journey, right? You have the valleys of death, and then you have those peaks of elation, and they can follow each other in rapid succession. These are roller coasters. And so, yeah, it's been, every one of these has been a roller coaster. I mean, Google Maps, you would think was in a nice, cushy setup, and you got canceled 3 times. I mean, there's somebody who compared us to a cockroach. They tried to kill you, but you don't die. So, it takes that as well, because that's when because you're believing in that mission, right? You're doing it for that. Same thing when you have to hear Nandan talk about Aadhaar, and he says there were so many times when he thought that you'd wake up in the morning to find the project gone, right? And you do go through that. It takes, you have to have self-belief, you have to have faith to keep going and sort of find ways to navigate. Sometimes if you can't take something head on, you have to navigate around something. And you have to believe that the mission is such that most people will turn around and come back and support it. So I think that is what you do to make it work.
And yet at the same time, in this journey, we see you emerging as an orchestrator, which is working between RBI, so many banks, so many payment systems, and convincing people to come and connect to something which they have never connected to before. They don't know what will happen. There is a certain scare of, like the question that was asked, saying, will it take away my business? So we heard that story, but how did you internally become an orchestrator? What motivated you to make that step out and saying, let me connect different things? Because a product manager may think very differently, but you were more like a product manager for an ecosystem rather than product management for a product per se?
So one of the things that I felt was that if you were able to get incentives aligned broadly, not just within the team, you improve your chances of success, right? I mean, even though you're finally responsible for a small thing, you know you will succeed only if you are able to, and you're sort of in a boat, right? I mean, there's a current. If you're able to align your boat to the stream, I think you have a better chance of making forward progress, and so on, right? I mean, it's just a question of making sure that whatever you can control or bring back into alignment with what you're doing, you just get a slightly higher percentage of success. And I don't, yeah, I mean, and you just have to constantly watch out for those and uh, keep navigating. I mean, move a little bit to the right, to the left, whatever it takes to, so that you hit that stream in the right way. It's hard to describe. I mean, I don't know if it's a conscious thing, right? But I think that's what I, sort of looking back at what we did, right? I think that shows up. But I don't necessarily know of it as being fully conscious.
Finally, would love to hear some thoughts about or your reflections about your engagement with global forums. Recently, you engaged also with the 17 rooms where you and Pramod had this conversation around digital public goods to serve the sustainable development goals. And of course, that's only one example. You have been to multiple international forums where you put forth this idea of thinking about technology platforms, ecosystems around it, building this societal change in a different way. What have been your key takeaways? What's easy? What's hard? What works? What doesn't work?
So I think what's worked for us is the success we've had in India, because we managed to succeed in a very complex and diverse environment. And we have made change happen at both a scale and a speed that I think has got attention. And so the key question that you get asked all the time is, what did you do? How did you do it? What can we learn from it? Is there some way in which we could replicate a part of it within our environment? And this is a conversation that has happened multiple times. It happens in developing countries. It happens in developed countries, right? I mean, I've had this conversation with the US departments as well, right? I mean, with people in the EU and so on, all across the world, right? Because what has happened in India has been amazing. And so from that perspective, uh, the simplest thing I can sort of say is, look, this is what we did. And it could potentially work for you as well, but I don't know what your ecosystem is like. So, I mean, I think just taking it and replicating it may not be the best way. But at least, if you were to understand this better, perhaps you might be able to benefit from it in some way. And in this respect, the various, multilateral institutions, I think, have taken this opportunity to study what's happening in India, write case studies, etc., to try and understand it better, to compare and contrast it with similar systems that are there in the rest of the world. So the World Bank, CCAP, all of these have sort of taken up these as case studies, tried to understand them, compare and contrast them with the rest of the world. And our constant refrain is, this is what we did, and perhaps we'd be happy to sort of teach you how to do it. And in some cases, that of course came back to what became MOSIP, to say maybe we'll build software for that as well. And I think that's what I've done over the years. We've just been ambassadors for the work we have done so far, and we kind of sort of stop just around that point. But the conversation is around how do we, because and I see the problems are very similar. The structures might be different, the regulatory structures, the environment. You're a small country, a large country, you have few banks, you have more banks, you have fewer telcos, you have telcos operating as banks, and so on, right? So you have all of these around the world, different situations, but the problems are the same. Many of the people are excluded. There are people who are getting loans and being fleeced, or they're not getting loans, and so on, right? There are traditional forms of finance, like in India, the chit funds, the rest of the world, there are different names, but Roscas is a term that's used. We see very similar structures in multiple places, but the net result has been that people have been kept out of the formal systems, and that is in itself a big problem. And so I think some of our engagement has been to say maybe what we have learned in India could be applied more globally. We don't necessarily know enough to say it will work everywhere, but we would love to take these principles and let people apply them in their neck of the woods. Plus, the other thing that's happened is that it's forced us to go back and think about what we have done and why it has worked. And so some of the principles around the India stack, some of the principles around the kind of abstractions, the digital public goods, the digital public infrastructures, I think a lot of this thinking has come back from a need to explain what has worked and why it has worked as well. And I think we have understood that a little better, which also, of course, helps us in doing the next set of things that we want to do in India. Because once you understand why something is working a certain way, perhaps you can repeat it in another context. So I think it's helped us. I think it also helps the rest of the world. And I've been fortunate to have been sort of the face of this for a lot of these conversations, including at the, like you pointed out, the 17 rooms process at the UN, plus as a part of a couple of other UN SDG type conversations. And I've constantly been engaged with the World Bank, ID4D, and with CGAP over these years on how such systems, how the learnings from here could be taken to the rest of the world.
Fascinating. To end the chat today, of course, these social entrepreneurs on the call, they don't everybody have to go and build something like UPI. There's lot that you can do on this infrastructure. You don't only have to build the base technology, you can build extensions, you can participate, because in the end, our intent is to solve problems for the society. What would be your one advice to the people on this call as they're embarking into doing what they are doing, assuming that they are not the ones who are going to go and build the next Aadhaar because we don't need one more, next UPI, we don't need one more. How can they do their best?
So I don't know what else can be built, right? Let's start with that first basic assumption, right? There may be room for many more, digital public goods and infrastructures. And also things are evolving. But I think what I would do is go back and look at the various stakeholders and try and find ways by which their lives can be improved. In particular, I like to see where technology can be used to reduce costs, because you actually, if you take out real costs from the ecosystem, you suddenly find many friends, right? You suddenly find many partners who are willing to come in and say, okay, is there a way by which I can provide a service to this person at a reasonable cost, which that person can buy, so I get one more customer and that person gets served. And that's kind of been our constant thinking in terms of a lot of what we have done is what can we do that takes out fundamental costs? And they may not be visible costs, they could be invisible costs, there could be friction in some shape or form, which you can eliminate. And that, I think, is one aspect of it. The second is to empower folks. And this is something which I don't think I fully always understand, because when you're empowering somebody, you're taking power away from somebody else. I mean, it's always the case. And so I think that's been one of the more nuanced things that you have to do, is to sort of say, look, let me empower the folks at the edges, because they are the ones who will then maybe find ways to help themselves as well. And that's something that you have always tried, but I don't know if we've balanced that line as well as we should have, I don't know. But that's something which is always a worry, is to say, how is this changing the power equation? And if you're changing it in the way that you feel comfortable is the right one, then I think you should go with that.
Wow, reduce the friction, empower the edges. That's an amazing message to leave us with. Reduce the friction, empower the edges. show what you want to do and iterate with your imagination. Some very fascinating conversations for it has been a pleasure.
Thank you, Sanjay. And I wish all the best to the folks on this journey, because I think the social entrepreneurship is a hard job, and it is something that we need for the rest of society to benefit. So I think it's a very selfless job, and I congratulate you for all of this, and do wish you all the best.